The judge had not even finished warning the gallery to remain silent when my sister stood, turned toward 12 jurors, and told them I had built my entire adult life on a stolen uniform. She never flew for the army, Brooke said. She never commanded anyone. She disappeared for years, came home with stories she could not prove, and now she wants this court to reward her for lying to our father. I sat at the defense table in a plain navy suit, with no medals on my chest and no photographs displayed behind me. My attorney, Miriam Lawson, did not touch my arm. She knew I did not need steadying. Across the aisle, Brooke wore our mother's pearl earrings and the calm expression she had practiced since high school whenever she wanted a room to believe she was the reasonable one. Behind her sat 3 local reporters, 2 bankers, the buyer who hoped to acquire our family company, and nearly every relative who had stopped returning my calls. Brooke thought she had arranged an execution. What she had actually arranged was an audience. Before I tell you what happened when the army finally opened the files she said did not exist, tell me where you are watching from, and whether you believe silence is proof of guilt or sometimes the last protection an honest person has. My name is Meredith Hale. I was 48 years old when my younger sister sued me in federal court in Wichita, Kansas. She accused me of inventing a military career, stealing $1,600,000 from our father's trust, sabotaging the sale of Hale Precision Aviation, and forging a final letter that removed her as controlling trustee. Every accusation was false. The dangerous part was that each one had been built around something true. I had been gone for long stretches. I had refused to say where I served. My official biography was short enough to fit on an index card. The money had moved into a fund connected to military families. My name appeared on a restricted accident report no civilian investigator could open. Brooke did not need the whole truth. She only needed enough shadows to shape a lie inside them. She looked at the jury and said, "My silence proved I had nothing." I looked back at her and remembered what our father used to say when we tested a machine part under pressure. A hidden crack does not stay hidden forever. Pressure does not create the weakness. It reveals where the weakness was all along. 6 months earlier, I had been inside a secure hangar at Redstone Arsenal when a civilian liaison stepped through the door and asked me to take a call. I was reviewing photographs from a helicopter gearbox failure. The images showed metal worn in a pattern that did not make sense. The call came from a hospice nurse in Kansas. She told me my father, Thomas Hale, had died at home just after sunrise. I had spoken to him 2 nights before. His voice had been thin but clear. He asked whether I still kept his old brass caliper in my desk. I told him I did. He said, "Good. A person should always keep one tool that cannot be talked into giving the wrong answer." At the time, I thought he was being sentimental. After the trial began, I understood he had been warning me. I flew to Wichita that afternoon and drove west through winter fields the color of old straw. Hale Precision Aviation sat outside a small town called Marlow, where grain elevators rose higher than church steeples, and nearly everyone knew which family owned which piece of land. Our company had started in a converted tractor shed. My father built replacement fittings for crop dusters, then landing gear brackets for training aircraft, then precision parts for military contractors. He liked to say the company grew because he measured twice and promised once. By the time Brooke took over daily operations, Hale Precision employed more than 200 people and supplied components to firms across 5 states. The house where we grew up stood a mile from the plant. Brooke met me on the front porch wearing a cream coat and holding a folder against her chest. She did not hug me. She looked past me at the rental car and asked whether the Army had paid for it. I said no. She said the trust attorney was waiting in the dining room and that I had made everyone sit around for nearly an hour. Our father had been dead less than 12 hours. I followed her inside without answering. The house smelled like cedar, coffee, and the menthol ointment the hospice nurse had rubbed on his chest. His slippers were still beside the recliner. A glass of water sat half full on the end table. Grief does strange things to time. One part of me knew he was gone. Another part expected him to come down the hallway and complain that we were discussing legal papers before supper. The attorney, Samuel Ortiz, had represented our father for more than 30 years. He waited until we were seated, then opened a thick binder and explained the trust. Brooke and I would each receive equal financial shares after taxes, debts, and employee obligations were settled. Brooke would keep temporary operating authority over the company while an independent valuation was completed. I would receive our father's house, his private workshop, and a voting block large enough to prevent a sale for 1 year. That was the first surprise. The second was a clause handwritten in the margin of a certified amendment. It said my voting rights would become permanent if I could establish honorable service and professional duty known personally to Thomas Hale. Brooke laughed before Samuel finished reading. Professional duty, she said. Is that what we are calling it now? Samuel told her to let him finish. The amendment also directed $1,600,000 to the Gold Lantern Family Fund. Brooke stopped laughing. That money was supposed to remain available for payroll and expansion, she said. Samuel replied that our father had been free to give away his own assets. Brooke turned to me. What is Gold Lantern? I said it supported families affected by military aviation losses. She asked whether I controlled it. I said no. She asked why my electronic approval appeared beside our father's on the transfer authorization. I told her I had never seen the document before. Her face changed. It was not shock. It was recognition followed quickly by calculation. She closed her folder and said the meeting was over until her lawyers reviewed everything. Samuel reminded her she could not dismiss him from his own client's estate. Brooke stood anyway. At the doorway, she looked at me and said, "You were not here when he was sick. You do not get to fly in wearing mystery like a crown and take control of the company I kept alive." I told her I had not asked for control. She said that was what made me dangerous. I always acted as if I wanted nothing, while somehow ending up with everything. Within 3 weeks, Brooke filed a lawsuit. She alleged that I had coerced our father, forged the transfer approval, fabricated military credentials, and interfered with a pending sale of Hale Precision to Argent Aeronautics. The sale price was $42 million. Brooke personally stood to receive a bonus of almost $4 million if it closed before the end of the quarter. That was the first number that explained her panic. The second came from a loan agreement Miriam found later. Brooke had pledged her expected bonus as collateral for a private debt approaching $2 million. If the sale failed, the lender could seize her home, her ranch property, and the shares she already owned. Greed is a simple word. Panic has more moving parts. Brooke was not only reaching for money, she was trying to stop a clock. I hired Miriam Lawson because she had spent 26 years in military justice before building a civil practice in Kansas City. She wore flat shoes, carried yellow legal pads, and had the unnerving habit of allowing silence to last until the other person filled it with something useful. I showed her the complaint, the trust amendment, and the transfer record bearing my approval. She read every page twice. Then she asked one question. "Did you authorize this money?" I said no. "Did your father know enough about your work to anticipate that your records might be restricted?" I said yes. "Did Brooke know that?" I said she knew only that I had been an Army officer and that I worked in aviation safety. Miriam set the papers down. Then, "We do not rush to prove you served." I asked whether she had heard what Brooke was saying to the press. Miriam said she had. My sister had already given an interview outside the county courthouse. She described me as a lifelong drifter who used patriotic language to manipulate an old man. She told one reporter there was no graduation photograph, no deployment announcement, no public award citation, and no retirement ceremony. All of that was mostly true. The first photographs from my commissioning had been lost in a flood at my father's storage unit. My assignments did not produce newspaper announcements. Parts of my work were restricted because I investigated aviation failures involving units whose locations and capabilities were not public. I had not retired. I was still serving. Miriam folded her hands. If we correct every lie today, Brooke changes the story tomorrow. Let her commit. Let her repeat the accusation under oath. Let her experts explain exactly where they looked and exactly what they lacked authority to see. A person can step away from a rumor. It is harder to step away from sworn testimony. I understood the strategy. I did not like it. The Army teaches you to identify a threat, reduce confusion, and protect the people affected by your decisions. Waiting felt like allowing contamination to spread. Relatives called me. Former neighbors left messages. One of my father's oldest employees asked whether I had really served. I wanted to send every person a photograph, a document, a rank history, anything that would stop the whispering. But most of the evidence that mattered did not belong to me alone. Accident reports contained names of crew members, medical details, protected maintenance sources, and operational information. I had spent years telling families that dignity required us to guard the dead from public curiosity. I was not going to break that promise to win an argument with my sister, so I waited. Brooke mistook discipline for fear. To understand why, you have to understand the two daughters our father raised and the mother we lost. Brooke was younger by 3 years, but she was always the one who acted older. She loved rooms full of people, clean desks, polished shoes, and plans with colored tabs. At county fairs, she sold more raffle tickets than anyone because strangers wanted to please her. By 16, she could make our father apologize for a rule he had set the day before. Our mother admired that talent. She called Brooke a born leader. I preferred the workshop. I liked the certainty of tools. A micrometer did not flatter you. A torque wrench did not care who your friends were. If a part was wrong, it was wrong. Our mother died from an aggressive illness when I was 19. Brooke was 16. Grief made my father quieter and Brooke louder. She filled empty places with activity. She organized meals, church visits, school forums, and eventually company events. I left for college on an Army scholarship. Brooke stayed close, studied finance, and joined Hale Precision after graduation. Neither choice was wrong. The trouble began when Brooke decided distance meant disloyalty and proximity meant ownership. I entered Army Aviation, first as a maintenance officer, then as a pilot, and later as an investigator after a training crash killed 2 friends of mine. People imagine accident investigators as technicians who arrive after tragedy with clipboards. The truth is harder. You walk through wreckage that still holds the shape of a person's final seconds. You learn to separate grief from evidence without disrespecting either one. You ask whether a bolt failed, whether a warning was ignored, whether a document was altered, whether a supplier cut a corner so small no one believed it could kill anyone. I became good at finding patterns because I never assumed the obvious answer was complete. That skill took me into assignments I could rarely describe. I worked with aviation units, special mission planners, engineers, medical teams, and federal investigators. Some years I came home for Christmas. Some years I called from an unknown number and listened while my family ate without me. Brooke built a story around those absences. She said I preferred strangers to family. She said I enjoyed being mysterious because mystery excused neglect. She was not entirely wrong that my service had cost the family something. It had. Duty always sends a bill, but she never acknowledged that our father knew the price and supported my choice. He mailed me handwritten notes in boxes of peanut brittle. He clipped articles about aircraft design. Whenever I returned, we spent an hour in the workshop before discussing anything emotional. That was his language. One spring evening, after I had come home from a recovery mission that lasted longer than planned, he noticed burns along my left wrist. He did not ask where I got them. He held the brass caliper up to the light and said, "Some measurements are yours to keep. Just do not let secrecy turn into loneliness." I asked whether he believed me when I said the work mattered. He looked offended. "Belief is for things a man cannot inspect," he said. "I have inspected your character since the day you were born." Brooke heard part of that conversation from the doorway. I saw her face before she stepped away. At the time, I thought she was hurt that he and I shared something she could not enter. Years later, I realized she had heard something else. She had heard our father say that my word carried weight without proof. For someone who measured love by control, that must have sounded like a threat. During the years I moved between assignments, Brooke rose through Hale Precision. She started in purchasing, became chief financial officer, then president after our father suffered a stroke. She was efficient, persuasive, and relentless. Orders increased, the plant expanded, local newspapers photographed her beside new equipment and praised her for preserving manufacturing jobs in rural Kansas. Our father was proud of her, so was I. The first time I saw trouble was at a Thanksgiving dinner 4 years before he died. Brooke had brought a bottle of expensive wine and spent most of the meal describing a new supplier called Prairie Meridian Metals. The company could provide certified alloy stock at prices 20% below the market. Our father asked how that was possible. Brooke said the owner had overseas contacts and low overhead. He asked whether the traceability records met aviation requirements. She smiled and said the auditors had no concerns. I remember looking up because she answered too quickly. People who know an answer often explain it. People who fear a question often close it. Later in the workshop, Our father asked whether I had ever heard of Prairie Meridian. I said no. He told me not to investigate his company during a holiday. I told him I had not offered. He grinned and said that was why he was asking. The next year, a military helicopter went down during a night training flight in western Kentucky. 4 crew members died. The public report blamed a catastrophic failure in the tail rotor drive system. I was assigned to a joint technical review because similar parts existed across several aircraft fleets. The investigation became restricted when evidence suggested the failed component had entered the supply chain under falsified certification. We traced batches, heat treatments, machine marks, packaging codes, and purchase orders. The deeper we went, the less the failure looked accidental. A drive coupling had been manufactured from an alloy that could pass a superficial hardness test, but developed microscopic fractures under repeated stress. Someone had substituted cheaper material and copied inspection stamps from a legitimate supplier. One fragment carried a machining pattern I recognized before I understood why. Hale Precision had used that same toolpath for years. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I did not tell the team the company belonged to my family until I was required to disclose the connection. Then I removed myself from decisions involving Hale Precision and submitted to an ethics review. The lead investigator, Colonel Adrian Shaw, told me my disclosure had come at the earliest responsible moment. He also told me something I never forgot. Integrity is not avoiding every conflict, Meredith. It is refusing to hide the conflict when it finds you. The investigation did not initially prove that Hale Precision knowingly supplied the bad coupling. The company had machined components from metal provided by Prairie Meridian. The false alloy certifications appeared to originate upstream. Brooke told federal inspectors that Hale Precision had been deceived along with everyone else. She provided invoices, receiving logs, and internal test results. The records looked clean. Too clean, in my opinion, but opinion is not evidence. I was barred from discussing the case with my father or Brooke while the investigation remained open. For nearly 2 years, I carried the knowledge that our family company was connected to 4 deaths and could not explain why I stopped attending holidays. Brooke interpreted my absence as contempt. Our father interpreted it correctly as pain. He never asked for details. He only said, "Do what the oath requires." After the immediate investigation ended, the public findings cited counterfeit material in the supply chain and referred possible fraud to federal authorities. No public document named Hale Precision. The protected annex did. It stated that internal company records were incomplete and that further examination was warranted. By then, Brooke had begun negotiating the sale to Argent Aeronautics. A clean acquisition would make her wealthy and move the company's liabilities to a larger corporate structure. If evidence surfaced before the sale closed, the deal would collapse. That was the second clock she was trying to stop. Miriam discovered the first crack in Brooke's story during document production. Hale Precision turned over 6 years of purchasing records. A junior associate noticed that Prairie Meridian invoices had been paid to a bank account sharing a mailing address with a consulting firm called Blue Prairie Strategies. Blue Prairie was owned by Brooke's college roommate, Vanessa Pike. Vanessa had no background in metals, aviation, or manufacturing. She did have a long history of forming limited liability companies for clients who preferred not to appear in public filings. Miriam traced management fees from Prairie Meridian to a trust that paid Brooke's mortgage for 14 months. The amounts were not enormous compared with the company sale. That made them more believable. Brooke had not created the scheme to steal millions at first. She had created it to hide cost overruns and preserve performance bonuses. Once the system worked, the money grew. Once the money grew, the lies had to grow with it. I asked Miriam whether we should notify prosecutors immediately. She said the evidence suggested misconduct but did not yet prove Brooke knew the material was counterfeit. We needed the receiving records, the rejected test reports, and the person who had been ordered to make them disappear. Then she showed me something else. The electronic transfer of $1,600,000 to the Gold Lantern Family Fund had been initiated from our father's computer. The second approval, the one carrying my name, came from a remote token assigned years earlier to Brooke. My name had been selected from a saved authorization list. The device identifier did not lie. Brooke had approved the gift using my identity. I stared at the report and asked the obvious question. Why would she move money to a fund she later accused me of controlling? Miriam turned the page. 3 days after the transfer, Brooke sent a letter to Gold Lantern claiming our father lacked capacity and that the gift had been made through fraud. She requested the money be returned to a temporary escrow account controlled by Hale Precision. Gold Lantern refused because the trust documents included a physician's capacity statement and a recorded confirmation from our father. 2 weeks later, Brooke filed suit and called the transfer theft. She had expected the fund to return the money quietly. When it did not, she converted her failed recovery attempt into a weapon against me. The plan was clever in the way desperate plans often are. Every step solved the problem created by the step before it, until the whole structure depended on no one asking where the first lie began. Miriam wanted to question Brooke under oath before revealing the device record. At her deposition, Brooke swore she had never possessed the remote token, never accessed our father's trust portal, never communicated with Gold Lantern, and never heard of Blue Prairie Strategies. She also swore she had no personal financial interest in the Argent sale beyond the value of her shares. 4 lies in less than 6 minutes. Miriam did not challenge them. She simply asked the court reporter to mark each answer clearly. When I read the transcript, I understood why Miriam had told me to wait. Brooke was not merely telling a story. She was fastening herself to it. Still, the central question remained. What had her father discovered before he died? And why had he designed the trust amendment around my service? I returned to the house and searched his study. Brooke had already removed the company files, claiming they belonged at the plant. The desk drawers held tax records, church bulletins, old warranty cards, and enough sharpened pencils to supply a school. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of farm magazines, I found a narrow wooden box. Inside lay the brass caliper he had asked about during our last call, a small key, and a note in his handwriting. It said, "Measure the part they say was never rejected." The key opened a cabinet in his private workshop. The cabinet appeared empty until I noticed fresh screw marks along the back panel. I removed 4 screws and found a shallow compartment. Inside was a red shop ledger, a sealed envelope addressed to Samuel Ortiz, and a memory card wrapped in wax paper. The ledger contained handwritten inspection entries from a machinist named Luis Ortega. Several entries described metal stock from Prairie Meridian that failed ultrasonic testing. Beside each failure, someone had written "retest approved" and initialed the change with the letters BH. Later pages had been cut out. The memory card held photographs of the original pages before they were removed. My father had preserved both the altered record and proof of what it once said. The envelope for Samuel contained a short letter. "If my death occurs before this matter is resolved, deliver copies to Meredith, to Federal Aviation investigators, and to the families represented by Gold Lantern. Do not give the original to Brooke." Samuel had never received it. Someone had taken it from the workshop and returned it after removing a second document listed on the outside of the envelope. That missing document was called the Iron Finch Statement. I had never heard the phrase. Miriam searched our father's correspondence and found one reference in an email to his hospice social worker. Iron Finch tells the order in which the lies were made. Brooke told the court no such statement existed. She said our father had become confused near the end and invented names for papers he never wrote. Her attorneys produced medical notes showing occasional memory lapses. But the same notes described him as oriented, decisive, and capable of managing personal affairs on the days the trust amendment and Gold Lantern gift were signed. A person can forget where he placed his glasses and still understand who is stealing from him. Brooke knew that. She also knew jurors might not. The next important witness was Luis Ortega. He had worked at Hale Precision for 31 years, starting beside our father when the company still used a hand-painted sign. Luis retired abruptly 8 months before our father's death. Brooke told employees he wanted to move closer to his grandchildren in New Mexico. Miriam found him living 20 miles away in a rented duplex. He refused our first call. He refused the second. On the third, I left a message saying I had the red ledger and wanted only to know whether the men in the helicopter had died because he had been forced to approve material he rejected. He called back 10 minutes later. We met at a diner before sunrise because Luis did not want neighbors to see my car. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders rounded, his hands still marked by tiny gray scars from metalwork. He ordered coffee and never touched it. Brooke told us the new alloy passed a different standard, he said. When I said the military contract required the original standard, she told me Hale Precision would close if we missed another delivery. She said 200 families depended on me not being stubborn. I asked whether he changed the ledger. He shook his head. Brooke changed it after I left for the night. The next morning, the failed lot had been moved to production. Luis reported the issue to our father. Our father confronted Brooke. She claimed the material would be used only for civilian prototypes. Months later, when news of the Kentucky crash reached the plant, Luis checked archive serial numbers and found a match. He copied the records and gave them to our father. "Why did you retire?" I asked. Luis looked at his hands. "Because your sister showed me a confidentiality agreement and said I could lose my pension if I accused the company without proof. Then she reminded me, my grandson had just been hired there. Fear rarely arrives wearing its own name. Sometimes it calls itself responsibility." Luis had one more piece. Our father had asked him to record a statement. They met in the old paint room after closing. Luis described the failed tests, the changed ledger, and Brooke's instructions. Our father placed the recording on a small black drive shaped like a bird, iron finch. Luis did not know where it went. He only knew our father said he would keep one copy where Brooke could not reach it and send another to someone who understood military evidence. That someone, I suspected, was me, but nothing had arrived. Miriam subpoenaed the plant security logs. They showed Brooke entering our father's workshop twice during the week after his death. She claimed she was collecting corporate property. One camera showed her leaving with a small metal cash box. At deposition, she denied taking any personal papers or electronic devices, another lie marked on the record. We then spoke with my father's hospice nurse, Evelyn Grant. Evelyn had cared for him during his final 5 months. She was a practical woman in her early 60s who carried peppermints in one pocket and a blood pressure cuff in the other. She agreed to meet us at the church where our father had attended Sunday services. We sat in a fellowship hall beneath fluorescent lights while volunteers arranged canned goods for a food drive. Evelyn said Brooke visited most evenings. At first, the visits seemed loving. Then Brooke began bringing documents. She asked our father to sign voting proxies, sale approvals, and a declaration stating I had exaggerated my military service. He refused the declaration. Brooke returned with the notary. He refused again. One night, Evelyn heard Brooke say, "Meredith is never going to show anyone a file because there is no file. You are throwing away the company for a daughter who could not even tell you where she slept last Christmas." Our father answered, "She could not tell me because other people were safer when she kept her mouth shut." Brooke said, "That is a story she taught you to repeat." Evelyn had begun recording the arguments on her phone after a social worker warned that pressure to sign financial documents could amount to elder exploitation. She played one recording for us. Brooke's voice was calm at first. "Sign the sale, consent, and I can protect everyone." Our father's voice was weak but steady. "Protect them from what? From the truth about the parts you bought, or from the truth about the money you owe?" There was a pause. Then Brooke said, "You do not understand the contracts anymore." He replied, "I understand metal. I understand debt. And I understand which daughter is ashamed when people die and which daughter is afraid she will get caught." The recording ended with a door slamming. I had heard my father angry before. I had never heard him sound heartbroken. Evelyn placed her phone on the table and said something that changed the shape of the case. 2 weeks before he died, our father asked her to witness a package. It contained a copy of the Iron Finch recording, the original Gold Lantern authorization, and a letter requesting protected confirmation of my service role in the Kentucky Accident Review. A bonded courier collected it. The destination was not a law office. It was the Army Legal Center at Redstone Arsenal. My father had sent the evidence into the one system Brooke could not enter through a company password or a family key. He had not merely anticipated a lawsuit. He had anticipated that Brooke would steal whatever remained in the house. Miriam traced the courier receipt. The package had been delivered, logged, and transferred into a restricted evidence channel connected to the continuing procurement investigation. Because the investigation remained active, the contents could not be released without authorization from both the federal judge and the Department of Defense. Brooke did not know a second copy existed. We did not tell her. Instead, Miriam filed a sealed motion requesting limited disclosure. The court scheduled a review. Publicly, nothing changed. Privately, pressure began to build. Argent Aeronautics asked Brooke whether the lawsuit could affect the sale. She assured them it was a simple family dispute and that I would soon be exposed as an imposter. Her lender extended the deadline on her debt by 30 days. She promised the acquisition would close before then. Local television ran a short segment showing Brooke at the plant beside American flags and employees in safety glasses. She said she was defending her father's legacy from a relative who appeared only when money was available. I watched the segment in our father's kitchen. Behind Brooke, on a shelf, near the inspection area, I could see a row of red binders. One label read non-conforming material. The binder for the year of the crash was missing. A small absence can be louder than a speech. Brooke invited the extended family to our aunt's house the Sunday before trial. I was not invited, but Aunt Caroline called and asked me to come anyway. She said families should not conduct a funeral twice, once for the dead and once for the living. When I arrived, conversation stopped so quickly I could hear the refrigerator motor click on. Brooke stood near the fireplace with a glass of wine. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of her and our father at a company anniversary. Every photograph that included me had been moved to a side table in the hall. Brooke asked why I was there. Aunt Caroline said because it was her house. We ate ham, scalloped potatoes, green beans, and rolls no one tasted. Halfway through dinner, our cousin Mark asked whether I had really flown helicopters. I said yes. Brooke set down her fork and asked which unit. I told her I could not discuss every assignment. She smiled at the table. See, she said, always a locked door. Always a grand reason we are not allowed to ask ordinary questions. I said ordinary questions deserve ordinary answers. This case involved protected records and dead service members. Brooke leaned forward. Then show us one medal. One commander. One person who will say you were what you claim. I told her our father knew. She said our father was medicated and frightened when I came home. I had not been home during his final weeks, but the accusation still struck where she intended. Aunt Caroline told her to stop. Brooke did not. She said after she won, she planned to seek criminal charges for impersonating an officer and stealing from a veterans fund. Then she announced that Argent would close the company sale within days of the verdict. Employees would be safe, the town would be safe. Everyone would finally see which daughter had protected the family. I looked around the table at people who wanted desperately for one story to be simple. Brooke offered them a comforting arrangement. She was the daughter who stayed. I was the daughter who vanished. She was the businesswoman who created jobs. I was the shadow who arrived with claims. Human beings often choose the explanation that requires the least revision of what they already believe. I said only one thing before leaving. Dad did not ask me to protect the company from you. He asked me to protect the truth from the company. Brooke followed me onto the porch. Snow had begun to collect along the steps. She kept her voice low. You can still end this, she said. Sign over the voting block. Withdraw your challenge to the sale. Keep the house if you want it. I asked what would happen to Gold Lantern. She said the fund would return the money once the court declared the transfer fraudulent. And the families? I asked. She shrugged. They are not our responsibility. 4 men died, Brooke. Her expression hardened. 4 men died because the Army buys from the lowest bidder and then looks for a private company to blame. I had not accused Hale Precision aloud. She had answered the accusation anyway. That was the moment I knew she understood exactly what the counterfeit alloy had done. Miriam later called it an admission without a transcript. Useful to me, useless to court. The trial began the next morning in a federal courtroom built of pale stone and dark wood. Brooke arrived with a public relations consultant, 2 attorneys, and a military records researcher named Howard Vance. Vance had written articles about fraudulent veterans and appeared on cable programs whenever someone was caught wearing medals they had not earned. He was not dishonest. He was simply confident beyond the limits of his access, which can be more dangerous. Brooke's opening statement described me as a skilled manipulator who had spent decades cultivating mystery. Her attorney displayed a timeline showing holidays I missed, photographs I was absent from, and company events Brooke attended beside our father. He showed the jury the transfer approval bearing my name. He showed them a blank search result from a public military database. Then he held up a copy of my short official biography. No unit history, he said. No deployment record. No public award citations. No retirement entry. Nothing but her word. He did not mention that I was not retired. He did not mention that public databases are incomplete. He did not mention the sealed motion already under review. Those facts would have weakened the picture, and Brooke had not brought the jury a picture. She had brought them a frame. Miriam opened with fewer words. She said the case would prove three things. First, that Thomas Hale acted knowingly and lawfully when he funded Gold Lantern. Second, that Brooke Hale used Meredith's identity to approve a transfer she intended to reverse for her own benefit. Third, that Brooke attacked Meredith's service because the truth about that service threatened more than an inheritance. It threatened a corporate sale and the concealment of a deadly supply fraud. Brooke's attorney objected. The judge overruled him and reminded the jury that opening statements were not evidence. Brooke stared at me for the first time that morning. Until then, she had assumed our defense would focus only on proving I wore a uniform. Now she understood we were going after the reason she needed the uniform to be false. Howard Vance testified first. He described his search through public records, veterans databases, graduation archives, news releases, and award indexes. He found a Meredith Hale who attended college on an Army scholarship, but he found no public record connecting me to the rank of colonel, to Aviation Accident Command, or to the assignments I had described privately to our father. In his opinion, the record was inconsistent with a career of the importance I implied. Miriam stood for cross-examination. "Do you possess access to restricted personnel systems?" she asked. "No." "Do you possess access to protected accident annexes?" "No." "Have you ever held authorization to review special mission aviation records?" "No." "Did you contact the Department of Defense through a court-ordered verification process before reaching your conclusion?" "No." "So when you say no record exists, what you mean is that no record appeared in the places open to you?" Vance hesitated. "That is one way to state it." Miriam nodded. "It is the accurate way, is it not?" He admitted it was. Then she asked whether absence from a public database proves absence from military service. He said not by itself. A juror in the front row wrote something down. Brooke did not move, but she pressed her thumb against the pearl ring she wore on her right hand. She had done that since childhood, whenever she felt control slipping. The next witness was the Trust Bank's digital security manager. He explained remote authorization tokens, device identifiers, login histories, and approval lists in language simple enough for the jury to follow. The transfer to Gold Lantern came from our father's computer. The second approval used a token assigned to Brooke. My name had been selected from a stored list, but the device itself was hers. Brooke's attorney argued that tokens could be shared. The manager agreed in theory. Then Miriam produced security emails showing Brooke reset the token password the morning of the transfer and confirmed possession of the device through her personal phone. Brooke looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at his notes. The first wall had cracked. Brooke took the stand after lunch. She wore a blue suit nearly the same shade as the Hale Precision logo. Her attorney guided her through childhood, our mother's death, our father's illness, and the years she spent managing the company. She cried when describing his final week. Some of the tears were real. That was the difficulty with Brooke. She could love our father and exploit him. She could save jobs and falsify records. Human beings do not become simple because they do terrible things. When asked about the transfer token, she said our father must have used it. When asked why she denied possessing it at deposition, she said she misunderstood the question. When asked about the refund letter to Gold Lantern, she claimed company counsel drafted it without her knowledge. Miriam rose with the letter in hand. Your signature appears on every page. My electronic signature, Brooke said. Similar to the one you claim Meredith used. Miriam let the answer rest. Then she asked about Prairie Meridian. Brooke said it was an approved supplier. Blue Prairie Strategies. Never heard of it. Vanessa Pike, an old friend she had not spoken to in years. The mortgage payments. A private loan unrelated to the company. The acquisition bonus. Standard compensation. The lender waiting for that bonus. Confidential, personal business. Each answer narrowed the space around her. Miriam then placed Brooke's deposition transcript on the screen. Under oath, you stated that you had no personal financial interest in the Argent sale beyond the value of your shares. Correct. That is generally correct. A bonus of nearly $4 million is not a personal financial interest. Brooke shifted. It was contingent and therefore not guaranteed. Your debt agreement required payment within 10 days of that bonus. I would need to review the wording. You signed it. People sign complicated documents. Did Thomas Hale understand complicated documents when he signed the gold lantern gift? Brooke's attorney objected. The judge sustained the objection, but the jury had heard the question. Miriam changed direction. She asked whether Brooke entered our father's workshop after his death. Brooke said once. Security records showed twice. She said the second entry might have been an employee using her badge. Video showed her face. She said she carried company property. Did that property include a black drive shaped like a bird? No. Did it include a statement recorded by Luis Ortega? No. Did it include the missing non-conforming material binder? No. Had she ever seen the red ledger? No. Miriam held it up. Brooke's eyes moved toward it before she answered. No. The movement was small. Jurors notice small things when a witness has told them to watch for certainty. Miriam did not introduce the ledger yet. She returned to my service. You have told this jury your sister never flew for the Army. Correct. On what basis? She never showed us proof. Did your father believe she served? He wanted to believe her. Did he ever tell you he had personally seen her in uniform? Brooke paused. At college events, perhaps? Did he attend her commissioning? I do not remember. Aunt Caroline sat behind us and whispered something under her breath. She had attended too. Miriam asked whether Brooke had ever requested ordinary service verification through the National Personnel Records Center with my consent. Brooke said I would not give consent. Miriam asked whether she had requested verification through the court. Brooke said that was my burden. Then Miriam read a passage from Brooke's own email to Argent. Meredith cannot produce her file because the Army buried it with the crash investigation. Once the judge forces disclosure, the company may be blamed. The courtroom became very still. Brooke said the email was taken out of context. Miriam asked what context would make it innocent. Brooke said she had been speculating. You knew there was a crash investigation. I knew rumors. You knew Meredith's record was connected to it, I guessed. You knew disclosure could expose the company. I was concerned about false accusations. Miriam leaned closer to the witness stand. You did not sue because you believed no file existed. You sued because you feared what the file contained. Brooke's attorney objected again. The judge sustained it and instructed the jury to disregard the statement. No one in that room could unhear it. That evening, Brooke approached me in the courthouse hallway while our attorneys were speaking near the elevators. She said I was turning a family disagreement into a criminal spectacle. I asked whether the 4 dead crew members counted as family disagreement. She told me to lower my voice. I said she had invited reporters. She stepped closer. Withdraw the supply allegations, and I will tell the court you served in some limited capacity. You can keep your dignity. I almost laughed. She was offering to return a piece of my identity as if she owned it. I asked whether she would also return Luis Ortega's pension security, our father's final months, and the years the crew families spent believing the crash was an unavoidable mechanical failure. Her jaw tightened. You always did love being the only moral person in the room. No, I said. I just learned that a machine does not care how important the person is who signed the false inspection. Before she walked away, she said something Miriam later made me write down word for word. The Army will protect itself before it protects you, I answered. You still think the Army and I are on opposite sides of the truth. That is your mistake. The next morning, Luis Ortega testified. His voice shook during the first few questions. Brooke watched him with an expression that tried to look wounded. Luis described the rejected alloy, the altered ledger, and the threat to his pension. Brooke's attorney attacked his memory and asked why an honest man waited years to speak. Luis looked toward the jury. Because I was afraid, he said. Then he looked at Brooke. And because she made my fear sound like loyalty to my coworkers, that answer landed harder than any technical detail. Miriam showed him the red ledger. He identified his handwriting. She showed the photographs from the memory card. He identified the missing pages. She asked who wrote retest approved beside the failures. He said Brooke. Brooke's attorney objected that Luis had not seen her write the initials. Luis agreed. Then he added that she had admitted it to him the next morning and ordered the lot released. The judge allowed the testimony subject to further foundation. A former quality engineer named Helen Park provided that foundation. Helen had left Hale Precision after refusing to certify Prairie Meridian material. She produced an email from Brooke stating that executive authorization superseded her hold order. The email included the batch number later connected to the failed coupling. Helen had saved it because she feared someone would blame her. Brooke's attorney suggested she was a disgruntled employee. Helen said, "I was disgruntled because 4 people died after my hold was removed. There are worse reasons to be unhappy with a former employer." Even the judge looked down to hide a reaction. The procurement evidence grew piece by piece. Bank records tied Prairie Meridian to Blue Prairie. Blue Prairie paid Brooke's mortgage. Internal messages showed Brooke pressing employees to clear the rejected stock before a quarterly deadline. A draft acquisition disclosure omitted the Kentucky crash entirely. Argent executives testified they would not have offered the same price if they had known of a possible counterfeit parts investigation. The sale was not merely delayed, it had been negotiated on incomplete information. By the 3rd day, reporters no longer described the case as a dispute over a possibly fake officer. They called it the Hale Aviation fraud trial. Brooke still held one advantage. The Army had not yet released my record. Without it, her attorneys argued that the company evidence was a distraction. They said I had used my father's concerns about the parts to steal control and cloak myself in service I could not prove. The jurors had seen cracks in Brooke's story, but the largest question remained open. Who was I, and what authority had I actually possessed in the investigation? Miriam called me to the stand. I stated my name, age, education, and current employment with the United States Army. Brooke's attorney objected to any unsupported claim of rank. The judge allowed me to answer subject to verification. I said I was a colonel serving in aviation risk and materiel integrity. I had flown rotary wing aircraft, commanded technical teams, and participated in protected investigations. I did not name units or locations beyond what the court permitted. Miriam asked why my public history was limited. I explained that accident files can contain classified operational information, protected identities, medical records, and sources inside procurement systems. I said secrecy was not a decoration, it was an obligation. She asked whether I investigated the Kentucky crash. I said yes, within a joint review, and that I disclosed my family connection immediately. She asked whether I controlled Gold Lantern. I said no. Whether I received money from it? No. Whether my father knew its purpose? Yes. Whether I approved his gift? No. Whether I forged his amendment? No. On cross-examination, Brooke's attorney demanded the name of my first aviation unit. I provided a public training unit. He demanded deployment locations. I said some were protected. He demanded award citations. I said the court had requested authorized confirmation. He smiled toward the jury. So again, we are asked to accept your word. I said no. You are asked to wait for evidence through the lawful channel instead of treating your lack of access as my lack of service. He asked whether it was convenient that everything supporting me was secret. I looked at him. There is nothing convenient about calling a widow after midnight and explaining that the part holding her husband's aircraft together should never have passed inspection. There is nothing convenient about carrying names you cannot use in public. There is nothing convenient about watching your own sister bet that duty will keep you silent while she calls that silence fraud. He stopped smiling. Brooke stared at the table. The jurors did not look away from me. After court recessed, Miriam received a message from the judge's clerk. The Department of Defense had approved a limited release. A military witness would appear the following morning. The Iron Finch recording had also been cleared for use because the procurement investigation was moving toward indictment. We had reached the point my father had prepared for. I returned to his house alone. In the workshop, I set the brass caliper on the bench and opened its jaws. Scratched inside one arm were 3 tiny letters I had never noticed. I-F-H. Iron Finch, home. I searched the caliper's wooden case and found a thin paper strip beneath the felt lining. It contained a safe deposit box number and the name of a bank in Salina. Brooke had searched the obvious bank near Marlow. Our father had used one 2 hours away. Miriam obtained an emergency order preserving the box. We drove there before dawn with Samuel Ortiz and a bank officer. Inside were our mother's pearl hair clip, my father's original company seal, a sealed copy of the Iron Finch statement, and a small envelope addressed to both daughters. The statement matched the copy held by the Army, but the envelope was new. Samuel advised us not to open it until the court determined whether it belonged to the trust. I held it to the light. Our names appeared in our father's careful block letters. Meredith and Brooke. Even at the end, he had written us together. The courtroom was full before the clerk opened the doors the next morning. Employees from Hale Precision filled 2 rows. Families from Gold Lantern sat quietly behind Miriam. I recognized one woman from a photograph in the Kentucky accident file. Her name was Dana Rios. Her husband, Chief Warrant Officer Miguel Rios, had been the aircraft commander. I had spoken to her once through an official family liaison, but we had never met face to face. She wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck. Brooke entered 10 minutes later and stopped when she saw the families. For the first time, the people she had reduced to a financial inconvenience occupied the same room as her. Her attorney asked the judge to exclude them as prejudicial. The judge said members of the public could remain unless they disrupted proceedings. Not one of them made a sound. Miriam stood when the judge called the case. She announced that the defense had received authenticated records through the court's sealed order and requested permission to present an authorized witness. Brooke's lead attorney objected. He argued the timing was unfair, the documents were impossible to test, and the military was interfering in a private estate case. The judge reminded him that Brooke had made my military status a central allegation, had demanded verification, and had been notified weeks earlier that a protected review was underway. He overruled the objection. The side door opened. Brigadier General Nathaniel Cross entered with an Army legal officer and a civilian representative from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. General Cross had supervised the Aviation Integrity Directorate during part of my assignment. He was tall, silver-haired, and more comfortable around maintenance crews than cameras. He saluted the flag, took the oath, and sat down without looking at me. The judge explained that some records would remain sealed, but the Department of Defense had authorized specific facts for the jury. General Cross confirmed that I had served continuously for more than 25 years. He confirmed that I was a commissioned Army aviator, a command-rated pilot, and a colonel assigned to aviation risk and materiel integrity. He confirmed that I had led and supported accident reviews involving sensitive units and protected procurement sources. He confirmed that restrictions on my record existed because of the work, not because I had requested secrecy for personal benefit. He confirmed that I had received military decorations, including an award for actions during an aircraft recovery in hostile conditions, though the full citation remained protected. Then Miriam asked the question Brooke had built her case around. General, did Colonel Hale ever lie about serving in the United States Army? No, he said. Did she ever impersonate an officer? No. Did she use restricted status to obtain money from Thomas Hale's trust? No. Did she control the Gold Lantern family fund? No. What was her connection to Gold Lantern? General Cross looked toward the families behind us. Colonel Hale recommended that the Army improve support after several aviation losses. Gold Lantern was formed by surviving spouses, retired maintainers, and private donors. She held no ownership, received no compensation, and did not know Thomas Hale intended to make a gift until after his death. Brooke's attorney rose for cross-examination. He asked whether General Cross could disclose every assignment I claimed. No. Every location. No. Every award detail. No. Then how can this jury test her story? General Cross answered in the same calm tone. By recognizing that lawful limits on disclosure are not evidence of fraud, your inability to inspect a protected record does not erase the record. It establishes the limit of your authority, not the limit of her service. The sentence hung in the courtroom. Howard Vance, the record's researcher, lowered his eyes. He understood more than anyone how precisely the general had described his mistake. Miriam then asked about the Kentucky crash. General Cross confirmed that I served on the technical review and disclosed my relationship to Hale Precision. I was removed from decisions directly affecting the company, but continued to analyze broader fleet risk. The review found that a counterfeit alloy coupling contributed to the crash. A protected annex traced the component through Hale Precision and Prairie Meridian Metals. The annex did not conclude that every person at Hale Precision knew of the fraud. It did identify altered inspection records and recommend criminal investigation. Brooke's attorney objected that the annex itself remained sealed. The civilian investigator stood and authenticated a redacted summary cleared for court. The judge admitted it. On the screen appeared the batch number from Helen Park's email, the same number in Luis Ortega's ledger, the same number tied to the failed coupling. 3 separate evidence paths met in one place. Brooke pressed both hands flat against the table. Miriam introduced the Iron Finch recording next. Our father's voice came first, weaker than I remembered, but unmistakable. He stated the date, his name, and his purpose. He said he had reviewed the company records with Luis Ortega and believed Brooke knowingly released rejected material. Then Luis described the altered ledger. Our father asked whether anyone pressured him. Luis named Brooke. He described the threat to his pension and his grandson. The recording continued. Our father said he had confronted Brooke after learning the failed batch matched the Kentucky component. He said she admitted approving the cheaper material but insisted no one could prove which executive knew what. He said she begged him to sign the Argent sale before investigators returned. Then came a voice none of us expected to hear. Brooke. She had entered the paint room during the recording. Her words were clear. "If you stop this sale, the company dies," she said. "If Meredith opens that military file, they will blame me for 4 deaths." Our father replied, "Did you release material after it failed?" Brooke said, "I released a lot that our own engineer was being overly cautious about. That is not murder." He asked whether she changed the ledger. She answered, "I corrected it." He asked whether Prairie Meridian paid her. She said, "It reimbursed expenses." Our father said, "You built a private road around every rule, and now you are surprised it led somewhere." Brooke told him he would destroy 200 jobs. He answered, "You endangered those jobs when you decided a deadline mattered more than a test." The recording ended after Brooke knocked something from a table and left. No one in court moved. The families behind us remained silent. Dana Rios gripped the ring at her neck. Brooke turned toward her attorney and whispered rapidly. He did not answer. Miriam called the investigator from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. He testified that the Iron Finch copy had been received before our father's death, preserved through evidence procedures, and matched the original from the Salina safe deposit box. He confirmed that federal agents had also recovered the missing non-conforming material binder from a storage unit rented by Blue Prairie Strategies. Brooke's college roommate had surrendered access after receiving a subpoena. Inside the binder were the original rejection reports, a handwritten cost comparison, and a note from Brooke estimating that using Prairie Meridian stock would preserve enough quarterly margin to trigger her executive bonus. The first bonus was $280,000. The amount was small beside 4 lives and enormous beside a decision that should never have had a price. The investigator also confirmed that Brooke's personal debt was linked to losses from 2 failed real estate investments and a guarantee she had hidden from the trust. She needed the Argent sale not only to become wealthy, but to avoid immediate default. Every motive now pointed in the same direction. She had cut material costs to protect bonuses. She had hidden the failed tests to protect the company. She had pushed the sale to outrun the investigation. She had used my name on the Gold Lantern transfer because our father refused to give her access. She had tried to reverse the gift because she needed liquidity. And when our father tied company control to my service, she attacked the service because the service file contained the one investigation that could destroy her sale. The twist was not that my military record proved I was honorable. The twist was that Brooke had always known the record was real. She needed the jury to believe it was false because the truth inside it was the evidence she feared most. Miriam returned to the trust amendment. Samuel Ortiz testified that our father had signed it while competent, after a private meeting without either daughter present. The physician who examined him that day confirmed he understood his assets, his family, and the consequences of his decisions. Then Samuel opened the certified copy held by his office. Attached was a conditional clause Brooke had omitted from the version submitted with her lawsuit. If either daughter knowingly concealed evidence related to the Kentucky Aviation loss, used the other daughter's identity to alter trust funds, or challenged honorable military service in bad faith, that daughter would lose temporary control of the company and the trust would appoint an independent fiduciary. Brooke had not merely stolen the Iron Finch drive. She had removed the page that ended her authority. The judge asked why Samuel had not noticed the missing clause earlier. Samuel said the copy Brooke initially provided appeared complete, and our father's office copy disappeared after his death. The certified duplicate had been stored with the sealed package at Redstone because our father anticipated tampering. He had created redundancy, the way any careful machinist would. Never trust one measurement when the cost of error is high. Brooke's attorney requested a recess. The judge granted 20 minutes. In the hallway, reporters crowded near the elevators. Brooke stayed inside with counsel. Miriam took me to a small conference room. She said federal agents were prepared to execute search warrants at Hale Precision, Blue Prairie, and Brooke's home. The civil judge would likely refer the sworn testimony for perjury review. Argent had suspended the acquisition. Gold Lantern's money was safe. The families would finally receive the support our father intended. I sat down and realized my hands were shaking, not from fear. From the release of holding still for too long, Dana Rios appeared in the doorway. She asked whether she could speak with me. Miriam stepped out. Dana sat across from me and placed a photograph on the table. It showed Miguel beside a helicopter, smiling with one boot on a step. She said he had been meticulous about maintenance. For years, she had wondered whether he missed a warning. The public report used words like mechanical failure and sudden loss of control. Families hear those words and still ask whether their person should have noticed something. I told her Miguel had responded exactly as he was trained. The failure progressed too quickly. Nothing in the evidence suggested negligence by the crew. Her eyes filled. She said, "Then please say that where they can hear it." The court resumed. Before the judge ruled on the next evidence issue, Miriam requested permission for a brief clarification through General Cross. He returned to the stand. She asked whether the Kentucky crew had caused or contributed to the failure. He said no. She asked whether their actions prevented greater loss. He said yes. The aircraft went down away from occupied housing because the crew maintained control as long as physically possible. Dana covered her mouth. The other families reached for one another. I turned toward the jury and understood that the case had finally become what our father wanted it to be. Not a fight over which daughter deserved his property, a public correction of a lie that had burdened the dead. This is the point where I want to ask you something. If someone used your silence, your grief, or your sense of duty as a weapon, would you expose them immediately, or would you wait until they had placed every lie on the record where it could never be taken back? Tell me what you would have done, because even now I am not certain there is only one right answer. The judge allowed Brooke to be recalled. Miriam approached with the original trust clause, the device report, the mortgage payments, and a transcript of Iron Finch. She did not raise her voice. "Did you know Meredith served in the Army?" Brooke stared straight ahead. I knew she claimed to. Miriam played the portion of Iron Finch where Brooke said, "If Meredith opens that military file, they will blame me for 4 deaths." Did you believe a military file existed when you said that? Brooke said she had been speaking hypothetically. Did you know Meredith worked on the crash review? I suspected it. Did you know her record was restricted? She always said things were restricted. Did you tell this jury she never served? Based on what I could verify. Did you remove the conditional clause from the trust copy? No. Did you take the Iron Finch drive? No. Did you access the Salina box? No. Bank records showed she had attempted access and been refused because her power of attorney ended at our father's death. Did you use your token to approve the Gold Lantern transfer under Meredith's name? No. The security manager had already shown otherwise. Did you request the money back? On advice of counsel. Her signed letter said she acted as trustee before any counsel was copied. Did you authorize rejected material for production? I relied on staff. Luis and Helen had testified she overrode them. Did Prairie Meridian reimburse your expenses? Brooke looked at the judge. I need to speak with my attorney. The judge reminded her she was under oath and could invoke her right not to answer if truthful testimony might expose her to criminal liability. Until that moment, Brooke had behaved as if the case remained a contest she could win with a better sentence. Now the legal reality stood in front of her. She whispered with counsel. Then she invoked her right against self-incrimination. Once, twice, 7 times. Each refusal answered the jury more clearly than another denial could have. Her attorney stopped the examination. Judge Regina Caldwell addressed Brooke directly. The court will not draw an improper criminal conclusion from your invocation, she said. But this civil court will evaluate the authenticated documents, prior sworn statements, and evidence already admitted. Brooke nodded without looking up. Miriam asked permission for me to speak before closing arguments on the narrow issue of the trust. The judge allowed it. I returned to the stand. Miriam asked what I wanted from Hale Precision. I said I did not want to run it. I wanted the sale paused, the records preserved, the affected contracts reviewed, and employees protected through independent management. I wanted Gold Lantern's gift honored. I wanted the company to pay restitution if investigators confirmed liability. I wanted the house because our father gave it to me, but I would not trade the truth for any building. Then Miriam asked whether I wanted Brooke imprisoned. I looked at my sister. She appeared smaller than she had at the family dinner, but not innocent. I said that decision belonged to prosecutors and a criminal court. My decision was simpler. I would no longer protect her from facts. Closing arguments lasted most of the afternoon. Brooke's attorney said she had made mistakes under impossible pressure, but had preserved a company that supported hundreds of families. He argued that our father acted emotionally and that I had turned protected military status into a dramatic shield. Miriam answered that pressure explains behavior, but does not erase choice. She walked the jury through the sequence: failed material, altered records, hidden payments, a rushed sale, a stolen identity, a false refund request, a missing trust clause, sworn denials, an attack on my service. She said Brooke had not been trapped by one surprise document. She had been trapped by the consistency of independent evidence. Tools, people, bank systems, recordings, and her own words all measured the same defect. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. They rejected every claim against me. They found that our father acted with capacity, that the gold lantern gift was valid, that Brooke used my identity without authorization, that she breached her duties to the trust, and that her challenge to my military service had been made in bad faith. The judge removed her from control of Hale Precision and the estate. An independent fiduciary took over the company. The court ordered preservation of all records and referred evidence to federal prosecutors. Argent withdrew from the sale. Brooke's lender declared default. Federal agents waited outside the courtroom with warrants. The reporters she invited recorded her leaving through the same doors where she had planned to announce my humiliation. No one applauded. Real consequences are quieter than revenge stories make them seem. Brooke looked back at me once. I could not read whether she wanted rescue, forgiveness, or one final opportunity to blame me. I gave her none of those things. I simply held her gaze. Months later, Brooke pleaded guilty to charges involving wire fraud, falsified aviation records, obstruction, and financial exploitation of our father. The government did not charge her with causing the deaths directly because criminal law requires proof beyond anger and moral certainty. It did prove she knowingly concealed rejected material and interfered with the investigation. She received a federal prison sentence, restitution obligations, and a permanent ban from managing aviation suppliers. Vanessa Pike cooperated and received a lesser sentence. Several company managers were cleared after investigators confirmed they had been misled or threatened. Luis Ortega's pension was protected. Helen Park returned as an outside quality advisor. Hale Precision entered supervised restructuring instead of closing. Some contracts were lost, jobs were cut, but the company survived under a new name and an employee ownership plan. Our father's surname came off the building by my request. A family name should not be used as a shield against accountability. Gold Lantern kept the full $1,600,000 gift. Part of it funded education for the Kentucky crew's children. Part funded legal and financial counseling for military families after fatal accidents. Dana Rios joined its board. On the first anniversary of the verdict, we dedicated a quiet room at the old plant to the 4 crew members. No corporate logo appeared on the wall, only their names and a sentence chosen by the families. They held the aircraft away from others until they could hold it no longer. I did not retire immediately. I completed one final year, trained the officer who replaced me, and left the Army after more than 26 years. My ceremony was small. That was my choice. General Cross attended. So did Miriam, Luis, Helen, Samuel, Aunt Caroline, and the Gold Lantern families. Dana brought Miguel's photograph. She asked me to stand beside it for one picture. For most of my career, I had avoided cameras. That day, I said yes. Brooke called me from prison 2 weeks after the ceremony. I almost declined the call. Then I remembered the envelope from the Salina box, still unopened because the criminal case had tied up parts of the estate. The court had finally released it to us. Our father's handwriting named both daughters. I accepted. Brooke did not say hello. She said, "You got what you wanted." I told her I had never wanted any of it. She said the company had erased our name. I said I requested that. She called it punishment. I called it honesty. Then she asked the question people ask when consequences arrive after years of warning. Why did you not stop me sooner? I said Dad tried. Luis tried. Helen tried. The failed test tried. The crash tried. You called every warning disloyalty because loyalty was the only word strong enough to frighten people into silence. She began to cry. I had heard Brooke cry before, but never without an audience she could influence. She said she never wanted anyone to die. I believed that. Wanting death is not required to make choices that cause it. She said she only needed one quarter to go well, then another. Then the sale would have fixed everything. I told her some problems cannot be sold to another owner. She asked whether I hated her. I looked through the window of our father's study at the winter field behind the house. No, I said. Hate would keep my life organized around you. I am finished organizing my life around you. She asked about the envelope. I told her I had not opened it. She said, open it. Maybe he left you another weapon. The bitterness sounded familiar, but beneath it I heard fear. I said I would open it with Samuel and send her a copy of anything addressed to her. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, he knew, did he not? Before he died, he knew everything. I said yes. She whispered, and he still wrote my name on the envelope. That was the first honest thing she had said to me in years. We ended the call without forgiveness and without cruelty. Some families do not heal by returning to what they were. They heal by refusing to pretend the wound is not there. Samuel and I opened the envelope at the kitchen table where our father once helped us with homework. Inside were two smaller envelopes and a single page. The page said he loved both his daughters and had failed both in different ways. He wrote that he praised Meredith for endurance and Brooke for achievement until each girl believed she was loved only when performing her assigned role. He wrote that secrecy made Meredith lonely and applause made Brooke hungry. He took responsibility for seeing the pattern too late. Then, he wrote that love did not require equal trust after unequal choices. The company must answer for the harm it caused. Meredith must not surrender truth to keep peace. Brooke must face consequences before she could become anyone different. I opened my smaller envelope. Inside was the original photograph from my commissioning, the one I thought had been lost in the flood. On the back, our father had written, I never needed the classified parts to know what kind of officer you became. Then came the warmest surprise. Brooke's envelope did not contain condemnation. With court permission, Samuel sent it to her unopened. Months later, she wrote me a short letter describing what was inside. It was a photograph of Brooke at 10 years old in the tractor shed, holding a broom twice her height while our father repaired his first milling machine. On the back, he had written, before you learned to win every room, you knew how to help without being seen. I hope you find that girl again. Brooke did not ask me to forgive her. She said only that she had placed the photograph beside her bunk and enrolled in a prison bookkeeping program that helped other women understand debt and restitution. I did not mistake one letter for transformation, but I kept it. Hope is not the same as trust. It is simply the decision not to declare another human being permanently finished. I moved into our father's house and changed it enough to make it mine. I turned the study into a legal and financial resource office for military families. I left the workshop almost as it was, except for one wall where I placed the red ledger, the brass caliper, and a copy of the corrected crash finding. Not as trophies, as reminders. Systems fail when people believe small compromises stay small. Families fail the same way. One altered line becomes one protected secret. One protected secret becomes a story everyone is forced to repeat. The truth usually returns through details people considered too minor to matter. A device number, a missing binder, a tool mark, a nurse's recording, a father's habit of making duplicate copies. On quiet afternoons, I sometimes take the old caliper from its case and measure a piece of scrap metal for no reason. The jaws close, the scale settles. The answer is what it is. My sister entered court believing that if no one could see my service, no service existed. She believed that if our father was dead, his warning died with him. She believed that if a record was removed, the event disappeared. She believed a confident voice could replace a correct measurement. In the end, she was not defeated by my rank, my attorney, or even the army. She was defeated by every ordinary person who kept one honest copy. Louise kept photographs. Helen kept an email. Evelyn kept a recording. Samuel kept a certified amendment. The bank kept a device log. The army kept the package. Our father kept faith that truth needs protection, not decoration. and I kept silent just long enough for Brooke to place every denial where the law could measure it. People still ask whether I regret waiting. Some days I do. Waiting hurt our relatives. It hurt employees who feared losing work. It gave public lies room to grow. But if I had shown Brooke the first piece of evidence, she would have changed the second lie. If I had shown her the second, she would have blamed a third person. By the time the truth arrived in court, she had sworn there was no token, no supplier connection, no ledger, no recording, no protected file, no trust clause, and no military career. She had closed every exit herself. Silence did not make me weak. Silence gave her enough room to reveal what pressure had been hiding. My father was right. Pressure does not create the crack. It shows you where the crack was all along. And sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is not shout over the lie. Sometimes she lets it speak clearly, completely, and under oath. Then she brings out the measurement,